Welcome back to Interminable. This is episode 3 with Calum Best. Calum is a fellow graduate of Liberty University, out of which I recently operated the Liberty Way podcast. That show is still in the archives of this one, if you want to check it out. My ties to Liberty were severed in the aftermath of my documentary series, Meteoric. That's on YouTube. That's far from the most controversial thing to happen at Liberty University in recent months. I never actually spoke to Calum on the Liberty Way podcast, but there are some parallels which are seemingly coincidental between the controversies there and the events currently in national headlines surrounding the killing of George Floyd. So we discussed that. This is a conversation primarily about speaking to power and using one's voice effectively. Here is my talk with Calum Best. Calum Best, thanks for coming on the Liberty Way pod. Oh, it's not, wait, hold up. Not the Liberty Way podcast. Thanks for joining me, Calum, on Interminable.
Yeah, it's good to be here, Matt. Thanks for having me.
It's kind of funny that I have you now because I just ended hosting a Liberty-based podcast, and you are a Liberty grad like myself. But that seems to be a relevant topic in a lot of ways right now, if not only so I can kind of have a postmortem on just what Liberty was during my time there.
Yeah,
both a
and
student
definitely
and
is
employee.
Liberty's quite in the public eye right now. Well, it's honestly hard to remember a time when Liberty wasn't in the public eye.
Right.
But it does feel bigger right now. You're right. So yeah,
And
it's good to be here.
I think that perception has undergone some evolutions over time with different influences and people in positions of power. Obviously, Jerry Falwell Jr. has his own reputation. Your reputation, however, as an introduction to you, Calum, I feel like your name sort of came up with a lot of controversies at Liberty as a student who kind of addresses the situation publicly, runs into a little bit of backlash for it, and maybe people don't quite understand what it's like to be antagonized by people in positions of power.
Sure.
What exactly got you into that position, and what was it like?
So my origin story, I guess. If that's what you're asking. Yeah, sure. So I spent 4 years at Liberty as an undergraduate student. Just graduated last May, so pretty recent grad. I was involved in a pretty high level of leadership in student government for my entire time there. So the first 3 years I was working as what's called the Chief Justice, which means that I heard appeals from students who were written up for conduct violations, for parking violations, even expulsions. I sat on a few expulsion boards. It was like the final level of appeal for students. We had pretty much all the authority that we wanted to overturn violations, recommend different ones, totally remove. We had a lot of latitude in that. And in the last year, my senior year, I was the chief of staff for SGA's executive branch. So basically in all those positions, I had really unique opportunities to get face time with Liberty University administration, the leaders that we, are trying to talk to right now. And I also got to see a lot. I was in a position of leadership. And so students would come to me with concerns, with fears, with successes. I heard the successes and I heard the failures, all of it. And over my time at Liberty, going through my development, I increasingly became uncomfortable with a lot of the stuff that Liberty University's leadership was doing. And for the first 3 years or so, I really believed in this idea that I could go through the system, that I could speak to the leaders involved and try to get things changed from the inside. But it just didn't happen that way. I mean, it took student government leaders, like literally the highest student leaders, an entire year to get one 45-minute meeting with President Falwell. When we went to other leaders, we mostly heard, you need to understand what Falwell's doing. You need to understand where he's coming from. You need to, not go public about this. Don't cause any firestorms with the media. And so pretty much what we heard when we tried to go internally is, we don't care enough to do anything about it. And so it came to a head back shortly after spring break, when all the coronavirus was first starting to hit in the news, colleges were shutting down. I made a public post on my Facebook, basically calling for the university to offer refunds to students who were financially affected by the coronavirus closure and leaving campus. Basically, they weren't getting the services that they paid for. And our president virtually admitted in a convocation that the online education wasn't even the same quality as what they offer residentially. And so my argument was basically, we need to get refunds for the students who, number one, are not taking advantage of services like food, transportation, and then who are also suffering a lower quality of education because of this. And even said in my post, this isn't about me. Like I'm on basically a full scholarship to LU. It really isn't about me. It's about my friends, the ones who I know are financially impacted because of this, the ones who are now having to pay rent somewhere because they can't live in the dorms that they paid for at Liberty. So I made that public post. And I got a call from the senior vice president of university communications that night. And he said, hey, I need you to edit your post or take it down because you've said non-factual stuff. You've taken Jerry Falwell way out of context, and this is wrong. I don't care about your opinion. I just care about the facts, and you've got the facts wrong. He also added my boss to the call. And so it was just pretty inappropriate, unprofessional stuff, right? For somebody who's in the leadership of your school to just call you from an unknown number. I don't know how he got my number. I don't know how he saw my post. We're not friends on Facebook. But he just called me in the middle of the night and added my boss to the call for whatever reason. And so that was really the turning point for me, right? When I realized that administration doesn't really care about dissent. They don't really care about solving problems. It's really more about pushing students to go internally with their disagreements, because when students go internally with their disagreements, those disagreements can just get shut down and quashed immediately, right? They can tell those students, we hear you, and then toss their complaint in the trash can because they're in positions of power. They don't have to listen, and we're not in positions of power.
But they're trying to give you a little bit of illusion of power, let the kids play government kind of. Yeah.
And that's when I started to speak up. So I wrote this long Medium post talking about that situation. And as soon as I did that, I started just receiving messages from everybody. I mean, alumni, current students, staff, even faculty, sometimes even reporters would message me, not to ask me questions, but to tell me, as reporters, we've experienced this same personal treatment from LU, bullying, abusive conduct, that sort of thing. Staff would message me and tell me, hey, I'm totally with you, and I see things behind the scenes here that absolutely disgust me from leadership, but I can't speak up publicly because I'm afraid I'll lose my job. And I just got married and I'm trying to support my family and I can't run that risk right now. That's what I hear a lot from people. So that's when it first started to blow up, and that's really when I started to have a really strong moral clarity and moral conviction that speaking up was the right thing to do. And now it's just kind of fed into this situation. As far as why people are paying attention to me, I think it's just because I've spent a long time building up somewhat of an image for myself as somebody who doesn't just shoot from the hip, right? As somebody who's decently considerate and thoughtful. People know that about me. And also I've been to the writing center enough times at LU that I'm decently able to write. So
you're very articulate.
I think just kind of putting a voice to things that people have felt for a while. So sorry for the long rant. Sorry for the long.
No, that was a good origin story. There's definitely a lot of clout chasers who follow up every controversy with their take. Yeah. Sometimes multiple takes. I mean, I've noticed there are people who will literally give both sides of a story depending on the outlet that wants their voice, because they would just want to have a voice. And you seem to want more than a voice. You want, like you said, not just representation for yourself, but you're trying to do some work there. And I feel like there's an obvious parallel with a broader situation, which is that like Americans don't know where they can go to air their grievances. They know like what the proper channels are a lot of times, but it's very easily dismissed. You can't, your voice is more a show of support or solidarity. It's not usually getting directly to the actual source of power and abuse.
Yeah. But yeah, there's so many parallels there, right? And a lot of people, the biggest question I've gotten after this post and after what's happened here is, what can I do? Like, not only what can I do, but how do I do it, right? Is there any way that I, as an average Liberty student, as an LU alum that doesn't really have any connections anywhere, is there anything that I personally can do? And the answer is yes. I mean, if using your voice and speaking up is always a better option than staying silent, right? Good people staying silent is the reason why these problems happen, right? Because not enough good people in the first place with coherent positions, with moral clarity, with firm conviction, they didn't speak up in the first place back when these problems were first starting. And that's how we get to where we are today. And so to some sense, I see what people are speaking to, right? They're kind of worried that at the end of the day, I'm just an individual person. And what we really need are people with real power. We need the people, the wealthy, the rich people, the well-connected people who can actually exert influence. We need those people to speak out. And that's how we make a real change. Yes, we do. But how do we get those people to speak out? If you are worried that other people have more influence than you, then what you need to do is get your influence to work on those people, right? You got to follow the chain of influence all the way down. And I promise you, it starts with the individuals. It starts with the people who are willing to stand up and say their piece. But yeah, you're right. There's so many parallels, like the current moment in America, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. So admittedly, I haven't been fully outspoken on a lot of, to kind of summarize the parallel situations. Jerry's antics, which most lately include joking on Twitter, pretty elaborate joke, however, that he should print masks with Governor Northam's blackface / KKK yearbook picture on them.
Elaborate is a good word for that. It's really hard to figure out the mechanics of that joke. I think another good word for it would be stupid and immature, but
I mean, anyway. the mechanics, I guess formulaically speaking, it constitutes a joke. Like if he's a comedian, you can spin that as a joke, which is not,
but he's
saying
not
it's
a comedian,
acceptable.
right? And that's
he's
what
not,
the whole thing is about.
Clearly
He's not
massive ignorance
of
his position. Yeah. Huge failure to see who he is in that situation. And then simultaneously, you've got one of the worst public police killings on record. And I feel like both of these situations kind of brought about this crescendo for their respective parties involved, where those who would normally hold off or say there's more nuance here, they might just automatically defend Jerry or defend the police, are saying, yeah, that was the bad one. Yeah. And it's kind of crazy, but still no one totally knows how to react to these things, because you can't just like demand that your president of a private school step down, and then the police is a whole other massive construct.
And you're right. I think one of the big things that's affected this situation is you receive a lot of comments like, oh, well, this bad thing is happening too. Why aren't you speaking up against that just as much as you're speaking up against this? And I hear that. Like, I hear that oftentimes the first reaction to something like my post is to think, well, what about X? What about somebody that I dislike more than Jerry Falwell? What about this hypocrisy? What about that wrongdoing? And the answer to that is, honestly, I don't have time for that. I can't spend 100% of my time addressing every single moral error and sin and wrongdoing that happens in this country. I can't do it. And I give two examples of that, right? One is that if I wanted to, I don't know, protest against our president or something, President Trump, if I had strong feelings about his leadership, there's not much I can say that hasn't been said already, right? There's people whose literal jobs it is to write full time about President Trump, to dive into every aspect of his personal life, assess every word of his interviews, and then write about it. There's not much original I can say in that case. And the same is true with the protests right now. I mean, just look on your social media. Everybody's speaking up. Eloquent people.
There's actually pretty broad agreement
about that. Community leaders, activists, like people who have real lived experience in these situations are speaking up. And I don't know what I could say that's original, right? I don't know what sensitivity to my Black brothers and sisters looks like right now. I'm not confident enough that I can say words that are good in this situation. And so as much as I can, I try to prioritize my time to speak on situations where I'm very knowledgeable about what's going on. I've had lived experience in those situations, so I can speak to my own personal stories and those that I know. And also I have the skill to speak up, right? I'm filling a void where there needs to be communication had. And that's what I'm trying to do. And you can see just from the reaction to what my post is, that it is filling a void, right? There are people who are uniquely touched by this that may not be uniquely touched if I were to speak up against protesting or against Trump or against Biden or against Northam. There's something unique about this. And that's, I'm trying to prioritize that. I'm trying to make the most effective use of my time, honestly.
Yeah. I think there is a case to be made for just kind of casting your vote, saying, hey, this is reprehensible. Yeah. I stand here, on the basis that when others see that someone they respect takes that position, it's a little easier for them to rally around it. But then the other case, and this is largely, I guess, what's kept me silent on a lot of very nuanced situations, is that if you paint it in broad strokes, and you seem to be kind of just running with the ideologues, that's going to take away some credibility the next time you want to take a nuanced position on a complex situation.
Yeah. But one thing I think is important to recognize here, that sometimes people demanding nuance is different than demanding outrage about another particular issue, right? And that's a very clear distinction to me. Demanding nuance is saying something like, well, you need to understand the backstory behind this. You maybe need to understand this follow-up tweet. You need to understand who Jerry's trying to appeal to with his tweets. Like, those are questions of nuance. But when somebody asks you, where's your outrage about Governor Northam? Where's your outrage about the protests and about the looting? I mean, you can just say, man, do you really think that I support somebody wearing blackface? Do you really think that I support property damage right now? No, absolutely not. No reasonable person does. And so it's like asking questions like, well, do you believe the sky is blue? Yeah, of course I do. Of course I believe that looting is wrong. Of course I believe it's wrong for people to wear blackface, and they should apologize. That's not what this is about. That's not what this is about. The side that I am taking right now is that the president of Liberty University's actions are unchristlike, irresponsible, and wrong. And I haven't really heard somebody give an opposite side there, right? There's nobody really standing up and saying, no, these are Christ-like actions. These are responsible, and these are mature, and these are wise. Nobody's saying that. They're just demanding that I apply the same outrage to Governor Northam. They're demanding that I apply the same outrage to all these other issues. And so, I mean, to those people, you can see the hollowness of that argument when you could just think about responding to those people. Well, where's your outrage about President Falwell? I mean, you could respond to them in the same way, and the chain could go on forever. It's just, there's no need to demand outrage. People love to talk about disputing points on the merits of them rather than making outside questions and outside attacks come in. And to that, I would say the same thing to the critics here. Dispute the merits. Dispute the merits. Don't call hypocrisy. Just dispute the merits, and if it stands up, it will.
Yeah, it's pretty obvious. I think that he's been living in something of an echo chamber, where just so much of his energy and attention is on Northam. Northam's the enemy. That he's become a little bit deaf to where the line is, really. And right. It's in some ways, this isn't even his worst defense in terms of just insulting the intelligence of the many people who he actually has influence over.
Yeah. It's hard to believe that. It's hard to believe that this, I'm going to put this in air quotes for those listening, this joke is seriously made out of a Christian respect and a desire to rebuke a governor when he has repeatedly and publicly called for seceding from the state after the Democrats gained influence in the legislature, right? That's not the actions of somebody who's trying to fix an institution, even from the inside. I mean, that's somebody who said, Democrats are in charge, I'm going to try to leave now. And what's funny is he knows that secession is never going to happen. That it's a totally ridiculous thing to call for.
Right.
And yet he's still doing it. There's no respect for leadership here. And also
he's living in the realm of parody at this point.
Yeah. And also another point is that last night, my post and others kind of launched this widespread base of Liberty community people speaking up against President Falwell. Well, last night he tweeted again and said the criticism of him is coming from a racist liberal media. I mean, he retweeted a guy saying that. That's you and me, right? That's undergraduates, that's students, that's alumni. That's everybody. That's the 1,200 plus people who liked my post. It's the 500 plus people who shared it. That's who he's calling a racist liberal media who's criticizing him.
Yeah, it's
just like, man, what are you doing?
This is like his ideology at this point. I mean, he's become such a Trump parody in a way. He's like a little kid trying to emulate the cool kid on the block as he sees it. That now he's just painting everybody who presents a challenge as whatever slurs he threw at you.
Liberal, and one of the beauties for him of communicating in that way is it always gives him plausible deniability, right? He can say whatever he wants, and then later he can come back and say, oh, what I was trying to say was X. I was trying to say this was a joke. I was trying to say, this like suddenly nuanced, thoughtful, and comprehensive point on whatever he joked about. And to that, you just want to say, like, man, you went to UVA law school. Like, you went to one of the top 10 law schools in this country.
Yeah.
You know what you're doing when you communicate. You know exactly what you're doing. You have access to a PR office and a media office that's filled with skilled communicators. You have thousands of followers on Twitter. You know what you're doing. And what's really happening here is he's just using the theoretical mechanism of a joke to just transmit vile images and political slam dunks. That's what he's doing. And then after the fact, he's demanding that we interpret him the way that he wishes we would interpret him. That's not going to fly. It's just like when people tweet some kind of like racist meme or something, and then somebody calls them on it, and they're like, oh man, it's just a meme. And don't you know what a meme is? And you're like, yeah, I understand what a meme is. You're using it as a way to
dog whistle too. Yeah, because they're having it both ways. They want to have it as just a joke, but it's also rallying the troops.
But it's like you know exactly the impact that these words have on people, and rather than own that, you're denying it. It's like, we know how communication works. We see exactly what you're trying to do. That doesn't stop us.
Yeah, and I mean, going back to the whole the expose that involved the nightclub and all of that, like, I don't care that if he was out partying. He denied that the pictures were real. Like, come on, man. Like, at some point, you got to know that people see through. They see through an act. They see that you're using a certain type of language around everything. It's this game.
Yeah.
And it's just
and so I think the important next question to ask, because you can like you said, you can literally look at that stuff and see that it's ridiculous. I mean, he said stuff. I mean, he told David Platt to grow a pair after he played for Trump. He told Russell Moore that he wasn't qualified to speak on any issue because he had never made a payroll or built an organization from scratch. These are people that are respected within the Christian community. Emails came out last year that showed him calling our own police chief a half-wit and showed him calling a student retarded. Like, you can look at all this stuff and see that it's deeply, deeply wrong. And so I think the next important question to ask is, why hasn't change happened yet? Why haven't the people with authority done something?
He's been successful in the same way as Trump at using this kind of vile persona to just continue establishing himself, and to somehow, I guess, he's got enough backers in his corner that whatever stand is taken against him is still just it's tiny. It seems insignificant, and I think everyone feels that. They feel that their voice is just a drop in the bucket.
Yeah. And I want to be clear, like, this isn't tied to Trump for me. This has nothing to do with conservative politics. It has everything to do with Christianity and how Christian leaders should act. Nothing to do with Trump for me.
Right. But except that I'm just drawing the parallel between the way that Jerry...
there are similar parallels to communication, right? I think that for a while he's been able to use the Jesus factor to kind of suppress dissent. Like, I'm a Christian leader. Actually, he'll say that he'll use the name of Jesus to defend himself, but then also turn around and say that he's not in charge of spiritual development and he's just in charge of the business. And so he doesn't
both ways
have those same constraints. And in turn too, students are kept suppressed by the constant calls for going to your brother in private when you have a dispute. A hugely miscontextualized Bible verse, and we can talk about that later if you want. So students are kept silent by that. There's just a a serious culture in evangelical institutions of deference to authority, even when deference to authority requires you to stay silent in the face of moral wrongdoing like this. Faculty are kept suppressed by clauses that say they can't speak to the media on record. Staff is kept silent by signing communications policies that say they can't speak to the media. Faculty who leave the school are kept silent because they have to sign NDAs to get their severance packages. The student newspaper is censored. Every article has to go through admin to get approved, and people were literally fired from the newspaper for trying to write negative articles about Liberty's leadership. So yes, you're right. It's constantly trying to have it both ways. The school holds itself up as an example of academic freedom and of free speech and of robust dialogue. But then at the same time, they do everything they can to restrict that dialogue from actually happening. And I think it's important to point out that like it's natural for institutions to do this kind of thing. It's natural for businesses, for schools, for any sort of group to try to maintain a good image, right? To keep the appearance that there's unity and that there's no dissent and no disagreement within that institution. But most of those institutions don't also say, we love dialogue and we like free speech and we love protest, right? You're trying to have it both ways. You're saying you love this, but then you're doing everything you can without directly saying, I don't like disagreement, to keep disagreement from happening. And that's the experience for many students. And I don't even know if all parents are aware of that environment exists for students.
Yeah, it's easy to project a different image to the public.
Right, yeah.
Let's just take a second to acknowledge that a Liberty professor did resign over this latest incident. And Christopher Guest is his name. He was very diplomatic about it. He explained his reasoning in a short letter that's now public, and he's gone. If you don't institute any kind of change or public response to something as eloquent and diplomatic as that, then you're waiting for it to turn less civil in nature. You have to start by honoring somebody who, of course the guy is mad. Like you can't just read into that and say, he's pretty chill about it. This is just a moral conviction. The guy's got to be mad. But he actually was the one with the guts to say, hey, I'm out. I can't be associated with this anymore.
Yeah. And I admire his courage in that. I mean, he just spoke out publicly against somebody who is an acknowledged leader in conservative circles and religious circles. So I respect the courage to do that. I mean, he also put his money on the line, right? He's not getting he's not getting that income anymore. So yeah, it's really impressive to see that happen. And I don't know if you saw this yet, but just about an hour ago, 35 Black LU alumni released a letter calling for Falwell's resignation. They said in their letter that they would not support sending people there anymore. They wouldn't donate to the school anymore. They would discourage people from taking speaking invitations at the school. They would encourage people not to accept athletic scholarships. I've been getting messages for like days now from people who said, hey, I'm a pastor and a veteran. I've encouraged people to go to Liberty for years, but I'm not going to do that anymore. I've had parents reach out to me and say, hey, I'm actually torn now between sending my kids to Liberty and other schools. I'm the mom of a high school senior, and now I'm not so sure anymore that Liberty is the right place for her. So yeah, it really feels like for whatever reason, this moment has sparked some kind of unique feeling about Liberty University and what should be done to oppose its leadership.
Yeah, that's massive. What do you think about people taking the approach of trying to campaign for Falwell stepping down? I mean, doesn't that have to be a voluntary move, and isn't that profoundly unlikely to ever be forced on him?
I mean, if we didn't call for things that are unlikely, they would be even more unlikely, I guess. And that's honestly, like, I'm not opposed to doing that right now. I think that's the right thing to call for until you see change, right? So there's this idea here where we hope to see change, right? I hope to see a sincere apology for a pattern of conduct that's lasted for years. I really hope I see that. But based on the pattern, I think that's unlikely. And so I think the correct response is to say, unless we see this change and unless we see a deliberate effort to reform yourself, to repent and get on a right path again, we have no confidence in your leadership. And we want you to not be our leader anymore. I think that's totally fair to say. And yes, of course, you're always hoping that it doesn't have to come to a leadership change. I mean, that's bad for an institution. It's a bad look. It's just not a good situation. But in the absence of real change and real desire to change, I think it's a totally appropriate thing to call for.
If I can change gears real quick and maybe call for a bit of speculation from you, if we could talk about the George Floyd situation and how Americans are responding to that. There's broad agreement that the rioting is a bad look, and some of the vocal response and the active response, I think, is actually going to activate a lot of change. Maybe not immediately, but sometimes these things take a while to kick in. But I think Americans will still largely be at a loss for how they can speak to power and what they should say with regard to systemic problems. Do you have any kind of read or opinion on that?
Yeah. So going back to what we said earlier about like being effective with the words that we use and the things we protest against. One of the reasons, for example, why I haven't been like posting about how opposed I am to looting and rioting is, one, it's obvious that I'm opposed to these things, and two, I'm not sure it would make a difference if you told somebody who's rioting, I don't think you should riot. I mean, clearly they worked through all those objections to do it.
I think when it comes from certain people, though, it is impactful.
When it comes from certain people, I'm not one of those people. And
I got you.
I think most of the influential people and elected leaders and all that are actively speaking up against it. But you're right. I think the rioting comes from, just a deep sense of anger and of injustice and of failure of the system to prevent stuff like this from happening. And it's moments like this, like flashpoints, that into those moments just pour people's pent up feelings of rage and frustration. And I think one thing that's like important to notice about this is that in the George Floyd case, we have no indication, for example, that there was actually prejudicial feeling on the part of that officer towards George Floyd. Like, we don't have that evidence. Images are powerful. And because we know that, and we've known this for years and decades, that the criminal justice system disproportionately impacts minority populations, specifically African Americans, like the image of a white police officer kneeling on the neck of a black person, like that's just so powerful. And into that you can pour this entire narrative that's been going on for decades, this anger, this rage. And that's why the protests are happening. You can call it about George Floyd, but at the end of the day, it's about a much deeper narrative, a much bigger, more powerful story. And that's what's animating all this. It just happens to be that image is so powerful. But yeah, like you said, I mean, I hope I see this turn into some systemic reforms. I think that until there's some measure of trust rebuilt in elected officials and in the system, this sort of civil unrest will go on for a long time.
Yeah, and I think that is the source of a lot of the anger is just a feeling of kind of hopelessness and helplessness. I want to draw a distinction on just a finer point of what you said. You said there's no evidence that it's prejudicial, and I would say there's not evidence of the necessarily racial motivation, though we can read into that. But I would argue that there's a systemic problem of prejudice that may or may not be exclusive to race, which is why a lot of times I will point to cases of non-sanctioned police violence against a non-minority, not to suggest that it isn't in other cases racist, but to show that the problem seems to be one of respecting differences, of an us versus them mentality in the police force, and that becomes applied more heavily across racial divides, because that ends up being a demographic or psychographic that they don't relate to and don't respect.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good distinction. Like, I should have made that more clear. There are different kinds of racism, right? There's racism that involves direct prejudice, and there's racism that involves a system that disproportionately negatively impacts minorities and other groups. In this case, those people that tend to be more disproportionately impacted, and those that tend to be viewed as less human and treated as less human by the system and members of the system are Black, are Hispanic, are members of other minority groups. And so yes, there's a serious component of systemic racism here, and that it's a system that failed to prevent that from happening. And yes, that's a great clarification. Sorry I didn't make that more clear earlier.
No. I was really capitalizing on it to make kind of a new point. But yeah, when you say systemic, I mean, it's to suggest that it's not, the bad apples argument really isn't what we're looking at here, right? I mean, this is one of many cases where you have a group of people who were all complicit by not stopping it and kind of respecting the maybe the fraternity more than the thing playing out in front of them.
I think it's really important to point that out, because really what we're talking about is it's easy to look and say there are bad apples. Yeah, we can all condemn the bad apples. Great. I think like Ben Shapiro is really known for doing this, like saying, I don't believe in systemic racism. If you can point out an example of racism to me, I'll stand with you against it. Like I'll do that 100%, but I don't believe in systemic racism. And I think it's really, really important to point out that these bad apples, these like quote unquote bad apples, they became bad apples for a reason. Like there are things that influenced them. There are experiences that shaped them. There are cultures that molded them. And if we really want to address the bad apples, we have to move up the chain, right? We have to identify the systems that made them the bad apples that they are, and address the incentives within those systems that incentivize them to act that way, that don't prevent them from acting in really negative ways. And that's what people mean when they talk about systemic racism, right? They're talking about systems that incentivize this kind of conduct and certainly don't disincentivize it. So yeah, that's what we mean when we talk about systemic racism.
And you can even see, like, especially right now, as forces are deployed, like tactical forces to address the rioting and stuff, you do see these bad apples stick out like a sore thumb, the ones that go into like Call of Duty mode when they are put in that tactical armor and vehicle and whatever else, and they know it's us versus them right now. It really brings out, I think, the fact that there's a fine line perhaps between the types of people that are seen as a good recruit and turning bad. It's that whatever's infecting the apple orchard, just kind of, when you turn things up a notch, that's when it gets really, really bad. And then the culture sort of encourages defending your brother, until he snaps. And
that's why reform is so important, right? Because like in a normal environment, if there's any sort of thing as a normal environment, the consequences of systems are so low level and pervasive that you don't even really notice them, right? It doesn't feel off to you because you can't viscerally feel, for example, the statistics that Black people are way more likely to be thrown into jail for drug offenses despite not using drugs at a higher rate than anybody else. Like you can't really viscerally feel that because it doesn't impact you personally, and you can't feel how wrapped up your experience is in a larger statistic. You just can't see it. And so you're right, it becomes more visible in moments of high stress. And also, I mean, always it's good to point out that many are not bad apples. Many resist the effects of the system. Many actively fight against them. And I want to fight with them. I want to support the efforts of the good apples in the apple orchard to make it a better orchard for everybody.
Yeah, it's been really cool also to see some of them actually stand with the protesters, not just like, hey, we'll support you, you guys are good, but to say, hey, like, I'm standing against this thing. Because there's a risk to themselves if there is a systemic support for the bad apples. Well, then standing against it is gonna ostracize you. So they're taking that risk, or they're placing a vote of confidence in their own.
Right. Yeah. It's been beautiful to see. Some people who are just, instead of kneeling in spirit, I mean, physically taking a knee with the protesters, saying, hey, I'm with you. I'm physically with you. I want to show you that. It's been beautiful to see.
Yeah. One last thing I want to talk about is I feel like there's a certain surrealism in our culture that gets brought to the forefront whenever there is a surreal situation, right? A thing you kind of can't believe what you're looking at. And this is, this has always sort of been in the water. Like viral content culture, it doesn't train you to see something play out actually like right there in front of you. It makes everything feel kind of unreal until you've had time to process it. What I'm trying to say is, in a lot of cases where people are out there in the streets and it's getting real, they're completely thinking this is viral, this is clout. And then someone's laying on the street bleeding or dying. And there's still, it feels like not even a human reaction to it, because they don't think that these things are real until it happens. And it's maybe a lot of people are just in a total dysphoria about it.
Yeah. Speaking of like what's the experience like on the ground versus looking at it from a like meta level perspective.
Because we spend most of our time looking at a meta level perspective.
Yeah. It's like we view most people as kind of players on the board to talk about, like we're not the same as them, right? We're not like on the ground.
A lot of people, I think, really they don't even believe another human is a human like them.
Yeah, and I think it's a unique component of, I've heard this in conversations about like what makes white culture, for example. Like I've heard, people often have conversations about like what is Black culture, what is Hispanic culture, and then you always come back to like, well, what is white culture? Because like if these races have cultures, right, well, shouldn't we too? And one of the terms I've heard thrown out there oftentimes is that the one like kind of unique trait about many forms of white culture is its inherent aculturality.
Yeah.
Right. Like people often view themselves, at least, people that are part of our race, as people who are kind of outside of that need for a specific culture. Kind of like we'll take the good pieces of everybody's cultural traditions and just kind of take them because they're nice. But we're not like a part of that. Like it's actually a commitment, right, to aculturality. And I think that the more we have instant access to communication, the more we have like near universal access to real-time events happening in all locations, the more easy it is for everybody to slip into that idea of aculturality, right? Like I am not actually a player on the board. I am the person moving the pieces, right? I'm just kind of watching what's going on and giving my takes. I'm not actually an individual actor with agency in this, and that's been really interesting to see. Like it's interesting that you bring this up, because I've been thinking about that idea of aculturality a lot. I think it's got some parallels here.
Yeah, that's a fascinating topic. I could do a whole podcast on that one. There's definitely some very strong subcultures among white people. But
oh yeah, it definitely wasn't meaning to like say that as a universal trait. It's just one factor that is just interesting to think about. And I'm sure that like you've, like me, heard many people sometimes speak disparagingly of Black or Hispanic or other minority groups cultures, in the sense of like, well, why do they have some kind of Black culture? Like, what does that even mean? We don't have that. But said in a tone of like, we specifically don't have that, right? Like we don't have that. We think it's ridiculous to have that. And so it's really a kind of unique cultural trait. We're proud of our culture of aculturality, right?
But then you get called out for doing something that's so white, and you're like, oh no, what have I done? Sure. Yeah, because I do think that dogma on any level and identity politics are dangerous. But then again, like there are experiences that I haven't had, and I just think everyone, regardless of what your background is, you need to be ready for the possibility that someone comes from something at an angle that you cannot. And also don't tell them that because you're this or not this, that you can't speak to this, because yes, we are two white guys talking to each other, but it's like, if there's no room for speculation and saying, hey, I think there must be some objective reality we can mutually arrive at here, then what is discourse even going to look like?
Yeah, sure. And this kind of, I think, goes back to, I brought this up earlier, the difference between a demand for nuance and a demand for speech, right? I mean, a demand for nuance is saying, hey man, I think that you should really listen to my lived experience in this and my knowledge on the subject because it might inform your opinion. It's an entirely different thing to say you can't have an opinion on that because you don't have lived experience, right? That's like telling men they can't have an opinion on abortion, telling, stuff like that. You're familiar with all the cases, but it's cancerous to dialogue, to tell people that they are not allowed to express opinions because they don't have lived experience. But it is very valuable to ask for other people to listen to your lived experience. And it's very valuable to listen to other people's lived experience because that can be one of the most informative things you've ever experienced in your life. Way better than an article is talking to somebody who's actually lived it.
Absolutely. And I think we can agree that productive dialogue requires humility, and I think especially at a time like this, honesty. Because if you start spouting things that you don't really feel, it's, for one, I don't think that's gonna have as much staying power, and it's gonna foster the ideologues even worse, and it's gonna frankly traumatize children. Like they will eventually,
sure,
having been raised just conditioned to think a certain way, they will look back and call you out on it, as every generation does. They'll say, "Oh, this doesn't seem to be my experience. What I've been told was the case."
So I'm a Christian, and so I try to follow the Bible in all aspects of my life when I can. And one of the verses that I think is miscontextualized a lot can actually provide a lot of help in this situation. It's when you have a dispute with your brother, go to him in private. Paul wrote that verse. Not Paul. Jesus said, I think that's the word of Jesus. Jesus said that because he's calling for humility, right? And in personal disputes between brothers and personal issues, it takes a certain amount of grace to go to somebody in person who you view as a villain, right? Who you view as somebody filled with spite and malice and kind of against you and all this. I think Jesus understood that it can seem a lot more difficult and a lot more painful to get off a moral high horse than to belly flop off a high dive, right? Like, high dive's a lot taller, but it feels a lot more, not more hard to get off that moral high horse. And what he's calling for is humility in that verse. He's calling for people to go to each other, brother to brother, sister to sister, church member to church member, and hash out these things with each other in personal relationships, solve personal problems personally. And that's deeply humble, and that's what Jesus called for. So I try to implement that for sure.
Yeah, that's the ideal. And what's the next step as a Christian when that doesn't work for you, when they shut you down? You can't always get through to them with love, and then you have to have the last resort.
Yeah, you have to have a last, but the point is that last resort should be a last resort, right? I mean, you should absolutely try to resolve things personally first. There's not an exact parallel here with this verse because it's really talking about wrongs and offenses, but I'm kind of taking the thread that I think ties it all together, which is humility, and applying it in this case. Definitely not saying that if you have a disagreement with somebody on a political issue and they don't end up agreeing with you, you should put them on blast on your social media. No, absolutely not. But
this is actually
an initial conversation with humility.
This is a good point to bring up because I think many times Jerry Falwell Jr. has been dealt with publicly by a lot of people as a friend to whom we show love and forgiveness and extend a second chance in a manner that overlooks the fact that he's in a position of power and leadership, and that the friendly versus political divide is kind of, you've crossed that.
Yeah, and that's why I think I mentioned that letter earlier. So these pastors and these people in positions of influence are in places where they can fairly say, we know what it's like to be a Christian leader, and we are calling on you as a brother to step down. Like, we are leaders and we know how to do it right, and you're doing it wrong. So that's their place. Sure. That's not what I'm doing, right? I'm not in a position of Christian leadership, really. So my post is calling on other people to stand up publicly and not frame it in the sense of, like,
we don't know his heart.
You're my brother, Jerry. Like, let me tell you that this is wrong. No, this is me saying we are leaders of we are followers of a public leader who's making public statements, and we need to make our opposition to those public statements very clear. That's how we're going to frame it. We're fixing a leadership problem. We're not going to a brother here. That's not the power dynamic. If you go to a brother privately, I mean, imagine DMing Jerry or emailing President Falwell and saying, "Hey, brother, I have these issues with you." He has no incentive to answer you, every ability to block you. I mean, he could even just tell you if he wanted, "Hey, want you to know that I'm sorry, it won't happen again." But it wouldn't mean anything, right? You have no ability to hold him accountable to that. It's a totally wildly different scenario than when two friends or two church members can go to each other. There you have some incentive structure built in, right? It's kind of like, well, if I treat my friend like a jerk when they rebuke me, I might lose that friend. If I treat this church member like, an ass when they come after me, I might lose some respect and have some serious social consequences here. But those are totally different cases, right? There's actually a real incentive structure there that keeps two people on the same level of power wanting to actually dialogue with each other. There's none of that here. None of it at all.
Yeah. Well said. I know we were all over the place with this conversation, but I appreciate you going there with me. This has been great, and I really appreciate your insight on all that.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed being here, Matt. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks, Calum.